afternoon, good morning. We are really excited that you are able to join us at the University of Cape Town for this global dialogue of student leaders during a time of COVID. We know that 2020 will stand out as the year that challenged us. It is the year that challenged us as university leaders, but it is also a year that challenged students and student leaders. For students, it was a year of learning how to adapt to remote learning and online learning in a very rapid manner. For student leaders, it was a year of leading students who are not present on campus and leading students in a virtual space, and of course that came with its own set of challenges. However, we know that COVID also offers opportunities, and one such opportunity is this event. A year ago, I think if we were to even think about organizing an event where global student leaders comes together and think about the world and the future world, we would have thought about the logistics, we would have thought about the cost, the plane tickets, accommodation, and we would have thought, well, you know, we don't have the kind of budget to bring together student voices from around the world. And of course, COVID has taught us that we can think differently about dialogue. We can think differently about bringing voices together. And we've adapted to this different way of engaging very rapidly. And so in just the space of this year, the way in which we think together have changed quite rapidly. And COVID has given us this opportunity to organize this event, which is an event that brings together student voices from across the globe to talk, to share insights, to share ideas, to share their wisdom of what they think the future will look like. So as the Deputy Vice-Chancellor at UCT responsible for student affairs, I would like to welcome you to this event where we will hear from student leaders about their views of the future and the world that waits us post-COVID. And of course, I'm very excited to hear their thinking, and I imagine so are you. But first, I would like to hand over to our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Pakeng, to officially open this event.
Thank you very much, Professor Feris, and good afternoon, Dumelang, Sanbonani, Botare. Welcome to this student dialogue, which is hosted by the Student Representative Council together with the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Transformation here at the University of Cape Town. We have people from around the world joining us this evening. Well, it's still afternoon where I am. I want to give a special acknowledgement to the panel, as well as the moderator, Rekgotsofetse Chikane, as well as attendees. Let me also acknowledge the presence of student representative councils, students and staff from across South Africa. A warm welcome to students and staff from Ghana, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Egypt, Brazil, the US, Canada, Germany, the UK, and Denmark, among many others. I'm sure there are many other people joining us elsewhere in the world. Those are the countries of people that I know registered. I'm also glad that this dialogue is happening, particularly at this time. The voices of our youth are very important in shaping the world. So it is important that at this very moment, we hear the voices of our youth. But I want to, in these opening remarks, I want to focus on education. We often talk about education as changing lives. And today, I want to turn that around and I want to talk about how lives can change education and shape the future of our world. More specifically, I want to talk about how young lives and dreams, hopes, and decisiveness can shape the future. Don't get me wrong, because I truly believe in the power of education to change lives. But as much as I believe that, I believe even more strongly that lives do and should change education and many other things too. And if we, as university leaders, do not recognize this, then it means we will find it difficult, if not impossible, to lead in a time of change. And this is the reason why I like hanging out with young people and listening and hearing, because I believe that it is young lives. I believe that voices of our youth help us shape the future. But to think about this matter as education only, or education only changing lives, assumes three things. It assumes, if we say it's only education that can change lives, first we are assuming that education is neutral, it is perfect, and doesn't need change. Secondly, would be assuming that education is benign, it is innocent, it just does the positive. And thirdly, would be assuming that education takes place in a static world. Paulo Freire said, it is impossible to think about education without considering the question of power. The idea of education changing lives evokes the question, in favor of whom or what? The truth is that education is political. And the more we silence the political dimension of education, the more we assume the moral potential to blame the victims of education and argue that dropouts are always to blame, or when dropping out happens, the people who drop out are to blame. And of course, dropouts for the most part are from the marginalized groups. It doesn't matter what country you look at. Most of the time, actually the majority of dropouts are from the marginalized groups or the minority groups. In many contexts, the minority are in fact the majority who find themselves outside the sphere of political and economic dominance. As an educator and a leader in higher education, I often wonder whether there is a possibility that some people emerge as dropouts from our universities because they are resisting or refusing to read the world the way they are being taught it. While many theorists are willing to describe a possible correlation between the high dropout rates and a low socioeconomic background of students, some fail to establish political and ideological linkages in any analysis. When curriculum designers fail to incorporate the values of the minority groups in the curriculum, when they refuse to accept and legitimize the students' languages, their actions point to the inflexibility, insensitivity, and rigidity of a curriculum designed to benefit those who wrote it. Earlier this year, I was giving a keynote address at a conference organized by Universities Australia. And this is a conference of university vice-chancellors and deputy vice-chancellors. And I argued that while many of us vice-chancellors can acknowledge that the education we offer is imperfect, that it may have negative effects, and that it takes place in a changing world, the weakness is that sometimes we assume that we as leaders know best on how to respond without listening or paying attention to the lives that we lead. And we in South Africa learned the danger of these assumptions the hard way in the last few years. There is no doubt that since the dawn of democracy in 1994, our universities have changed radically, or perhaps higher education in South Africa has changed radically. We have purposefully and creatively defined a comprehensive transformation agenda and policy framework for higher education that puts us on the road to overcoming our apartheid past and creating a higher education system that is more suited to the needs of a socially equitable and developing democracy. With a new higher education landscape of a single, coordinated and differentiated system of higher education encompassing universities of technology, special focus and comprehensive institutions, contact and distance institutions, and various kinds of colleges. And university student enrollments have grown from about 470,000 in 1993 to over 1 million students as we speak. And Black students comprise over 80% of the student body, and women comprise 58%. It's an achievement, albeit being tempered by a high dropout rate or poor graduation rates. Still, it's a success that has given rise to important new challenges, including the 2015 to 2017 student protests. In many ways, we as university leaders looked at the numbers, transformation in terms of numbers of students at universities, and thought that this was a picture of success. Since apartheid, we have brought a large number of Black students into education or into higher education. And we thought now education could go ahead with changing their lives and nothing more needed to be done. In other words, there was an expectation that these students would come into the university and accept the university as perfect and that it would, or the education as perfect and that it would change their lives for the better. In fact, it can be argued today that we as higher education leaders of the time failed these students because there was no recognition of the fact that this changing student body required a different kind of institution, different ways of engaging with them, and a different kind of leadership. We paid a huge price. Between 2015 and 2017, we had to contend with the student protest movements, hashtag Rhodes Must Fall, which led to the removal of the Rhodes statue from its prime position on our campus, and hashtag Africans Must Fall in the intellectual space, hashtag Fees Must Fall in the material and admission space, and hashtag Outsourcing Must Fall in the space of workers. While these student movements or protests were mainly in universities, they are profoundly about political change. They are part of a larger challenge to the ruling elite, confronting constitutional agnosticism, corruption, and white privilege, all of which confront poverty and inequality. They are also not limited to South Africa, because the deeper issues of inequality and cultural alienation are urgent international issues. We have seen student protests during the same period, as well as demands for transformation and decolonization flare up in many countries around the world, including the UK, the USA, and in the Netherlands, where they had their own share with the demands of the new university, as well as the Bajonaise and the Magenaise occupations. Through these movements, students challenged the expectation that they should assimilate and accept the education before them as benign and good for them. They called for the complete rejection of the systemic, symbolic, and intellectual worlds which are inhospitable. They made a point that they don't feel at home in our universities. They do not recognize themselves in what they have to learn, the buildings, the artwork, the curriculum, or the people leading them. They demanded the decolonization of higher education. They pushed universities and government leadership to the point where finally in South Africa, their lives changed the education system. Lives of young people changed some things about our system. They started a challenging but exciting journey of radical transformation in our universities, which is terribly painful. It's going on, and I call it terribly painful because there are already casualties as the anti-transformation forces tighten their grip. But here's the thing, the student activists could only demand this change because they had been changed by the education that they've been getting at universities. It was the education they received from the very universities that equipped them with the tools they used to critique and change it. And here we are today. Higher education around the world is facing a similar kind of uncertainty as a result of COVID-19, as well as challenges that the future, challenges about what the future of higher education and the future of universities is or should be post-COVID-19. The student voice is not only relevant in this conversation, but it is key in this conversation about the future of higher education or the future of universities. Fact of the matter is, we cannot go back to the kind of normal we know, or the kind of normal we are used to, or the kind of normal that we are comfortable with. But then who should decide what the new normal should be? It is for this reason that I challenged DVC Feris and Edwina that we need to hear students' voices on this question of the future. And I'm glad that they took the challenge when I called them to a meeting and I said, we are in a lockdown. We are all having conversations, but we don't get, why are we not hearing the voices of our students? I'm glad that we are here now because they've taken the challenge, and I'm glad that the SRC is leading this. We all know that the normal as we know it has never been and will never be ideal. COVID-19 is not the only threat we face. Climate change, poverty and inequality, gender-based violence, the loss of biodiversity, unsustainable use of resources, overpopulation and human migration, the effects of rising technology on jobs, lifestyle diseases like diabetes and obesity, along with a whole range of health threats like malaria and tuberculosis. These are global-sized problems. The truth is that we can spend time here arguing about who or what created them. And whilst it may be important to understand the genesis of the problems or the challenges we face, my view is that we should rather spend time thinking and exploring possible scenarios for the future, particularly the future of higher education. My hope is that during the last 6 months of the lockdown, with its challenges of remote learning, you have been forced to ask difficult questions about yourself, your country, and the world. I also hope that your experience, good or bad, with remote emergency teaching has made you think about the many possibilities in which higher education can be made more accessible and impactful in our world. For us as the UCT leadership, COVID-19 hit us at a time when we were busy with the development of our Vision 2030. There is no better time to think about the future than now, with the world being turned upside down. So we developed our Vision 2030, and we developed it from a place of discomfort. First, a discomfort with the idea that the future is a place to which we arrive and to which we have to adapt. Second, a discomfort with UCT's complacency about its status as the top-ranked university in Africa. We have decided to take a critical view of ourselves as an institution by defining excellence, transformation, and sustainability as interdependent so that we can be the best for Africa. And third, we developed this Vision 2030 from a place of discomfort with UCT's colonial and apartheid history and the need to affirm our university's African identity, reclaim African agency, and commit to the future of the continent as a global African university. I challenge you today, as student leaders, to think about the place from which you think about the future. Finally, let me say to you that the shaping and leading of the future cannot happen without hope, without commitment, and without decisiveness. Hope is a powerful thing. It inspires us to do the impossible and helps us carry on even during difficult times when nobody expects you to carry on. Hope is what carries you on, helps you to carry on. Commitment is what transforms vision into reality. We cannot transform vision into reality without commitment. And then decisiveness is key, because whatever decision it is, you have to make it. And as the wise say, all the paths kneel before the decisive minds. My hope is that you will, as you engage with the future, you will take these three things into consideration and consider the place from which you think about the future. Let me hand over to our Honorable President, SRC President Akha Tutu. Thank you very much, DVC Feris.
Thank you so much, VC. Thank you so much for that enlightening and very encouraging, invigorating, opening remarks. Let me first start by welcoming everybody, everywhere they are across the world, all those who are joining us in this very exciting and promising to be very much engaging and encouraging engagement. I must first of all, of course, welcome specifically my fellow students across the whole world, or should I say my fellow comrades, because we're now in the same struggle, remote learning, most parts of the world, I believe. Welcome to all of you, as well as to fellow students here in my university who are joining us for this event that I've already highlighted, that it promises to be really invigorating and exciting. exciting. Thank you to all and everyone and the organizers, including Professor Feris for organizing this, of course, in partnership with us as student leaders for organizing this exciting event. This is specifically, what I'm going to say is specifically directed to fellow students across the world. Crises, like, as we all understand, that crises are moments of opportunity or chance, particularly where there is young people with minds that work and strength to actually affect the world for a better change, so that we live in a better world in the future. And therefore, in the line of crises being opportunities for change, what we've also learned during this time of COVID-19 is that collaborations across borders within our countries, as student leaders, with university management, are the most important things that will actually put us. They are very critical, because it is through the collaborations that ideas come for us to change the world. Particularly global solidarity, because not only, rather, what global solidarity gives us an opportunity is to not look internally and look at what we already know as solutions, but to look far afield so as to be able to find other ways of thinking and approaches to solving common challenges. Those challenges, I will not get into mentioning them. The VC has already articulated them very well. So in those few words, that is me trying to say welcome and feel free and enjoy this exciting event. Now, I must move on to introduce our wonderful chair for tonight. The name of our chair is Rekgotsofetse Chikane. By the way, before I read his bio, I must just highlight that he actually served in the same structure as me as the Deputy Vice-President or the Vice President in SRC in the year 2012 and 2013. So today he's come back home. I guess there's no place better than home. We always find our way back home, because he will be moderating this engagement today. So Rekgotsofetse Chikane is the author of Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation, the Politics Behind the Must Fall Movements. He currently works as a lecturer of public policy at the University of Witwatersrand. He is a graduate of the University of Oxford, having completed his master's in public policy degree, and is a PhD candidate at the University of Witwatersrand School of Governance. His research is currently focused on decolonial development and complexity economics. He is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar for 2015, a recipient of the Mandela Washington Fellowship for 2016, an Obama African Leader for 2019, and a South Africa Washington International Program alumni. He was recognized as one of the Mail and Guardian's top 200 young South Africans. Mail and Guardian is one of the leading newspapers in our country. So he was considered one of the 200 young South Africans by that publication in 2016, and is the former national president of Inkulu Vryheid. Rekgotsofetse, coordinator, over to you.
No, thanks for that, Akha. It's always odd when someone reads out your bio. But it's always a lot more awkward when you're sitting in the room and people are staring at you. So I kind of like this one where no one can see me wince and look all nervous. So my job today is actually very easy. It is to allow all our participants to hear the wonderful words from all our speakers today. We're going to be talking on something that is an extremely important topic in our country and at our global level. Now, over the past decade, whether people realize it or not, but we've had a really bizarre thing that's happened, which is almost every single year across the country, across the world, we've had monumental moments of change, right? We've had young people, whether it is the Arab Spring, whether it is the protests that happened in Chile back in 2010, 2011, whether it's the emergence of Black Lives Matter, whether it's the emergence of must-fall politics, whether it is the Hong Kong protest and the Umbrella Revolution, whether it is young people on the African continent from Burkina Faso to Burundi who are actively asking for change, or student leaders across the European continent, we've seen an unprecedented level of youth activism across the world. Unprecedented in the sense that even though we've had youth activism throughout history almost, right, we've seen it emerge in such a way that when you look at it carefully enough, you start seeing a lot of similarities. The strategy and tactics that students utilize across the world. We're talking about groupings that have never talked to each other before, groupings that have never had a meeting with each other before, but have similar ideologies and similar criticisms of how our society functions. But today we're here to talk about how COVID-19 in particular fits within this mold. Now, there's a theory in public policy called the multiple streams approach. And the multiple streams approach essentially says that, and I won't go into too much detail, but essentially says that every now and again, when it comes to politics and public policy across the world, there are things that we describe as windows of opportunity, right? And within these windows of opportunity, massive amounts of change can be made to your society, right? Because the politics and the problems and the solutions that emanate during that time have created a perfect storm of change. Now, these windows of opportunity really come once in a lifetime, right? Whether it is the end of World War II, whether it is the oil shock in the 1970s, whether it is the financial crisis in 2008, we currently find ourselves in a brand new window of opportunity caused by the COVID pandemic that has rocked our globe. And within this context, it begs the question of what is our role as young people, as young student leaders across this planet, to essentially say, how do we take advantage of this opportunity, right? How do we take advantage of this opportunity that has caused massive amounts of misery across the world? To essentially say, how do we criticize the status quo of our planet? How do we criticize the things that people said are the normal, right? How do we criticize the level of poverty across the globe? How do we actively change the amount of disregard for climate change that is happening across the globe? And within this moment, it begs the question of what is our roles and responsibilities as young emerging leaders to take responsibility for things as, and my dad always gets annoyed with me when I say this, for the faults of our parents, right? For the failures of our parents to create the change that we want to create. How do we create it ourselves so that our children 20 years from now don't ask us the same questions? And the only way we can do that is when we really come together. And for me, I think this panel is going to be fantastic. We've got fantastic speakers from across the world. And usually in South Africa, I get very annoyed when people read out bios. However, in this situation, I think we have some really interesting people. So I will avoid using the phrase all protocol observed and really go into detail about our speakers. So our first speaker that we have today is Peter Kwasi Kodjie. Now, Peter is currently the Secretary General of the All Africa Students Union, and he's represented students in Africa. He represents students of Africa on the Tuning Africa Project Advisory Group, and currently serves as an advisory board member of the Harmonization of African Higher Education Quality Assurance and Accreditation Initiative. And he's also part of the Africa Continental Qualifications Framework, a joint European Union, African Union project on the harmonization of higher education ecosystems across the continent. Together with other youth leaders, Peter is a trustee on the 100 Million Campaign for Marginalized Children, which is founded by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Kailash Satyarthi. Peter has a strong passion for leadership, youth empowerment, and human rights. Our next speaker is going to be Ester Simon, and Ester is a firmly rooted Pan-Africanist, is a youth and student activist, and she currently serves as the Executive Communication and Publicity Secretary for the Southern African Students Union, which is the mother body for student unions in SADC, which is the Southern African Development Community. She is concurrently serving as the chairperson of the African Union Youth Club and the Namibian chapter in particular. After Ester, we'll have Larissa Kennedy, who at the age of 22 is an award-winning Black feminist social activist and community organizer from South London with roots in Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Vincent. Larissa is president of the National Union of Students, having been elected to represent 7 million students across further and higher education in the UK. She's also a trustee of the British Youth Council and the founder of the Warwick Decolonize Project. Larissa campaigns for free, accessible, lifelong education and believes that student-powered organizing grounded in liberation and internationalism can radically transform education to achieve this vision. In her work beyond the student movement, she's also the UK's representative to the Global Secretariat of Youth for Change. She's a member of the British Youth Council and is part of the Women Deliver Young Leader, and was formerly the UK's youth delegate to the Council of Europe Congress of Local and Regional Authorities. Our final speaker today is Carolina Pavanelli. Now, Carolina graduated in social communication from the University of the Federal Fluminense and has an MBA in business management from the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Brazil. She's currently a master's student in social sciences at the same institution. Carolina has been working with education for 10 years, working in both the teaching staff of high schools, as well as leading the pedagogical sector of a teaching platform, where she is responsible for the elaboration of didactic material curricula and for teacher training programs. So as you can see, we have an esteemed panel today, and often the STEAM doesn't get used for young leaders, and I think it is underutilized for the young people who really represent us across the world. So I'm going to give it over to Peter, who will be our first speaker for today. And Peter, I hope you really challenge us. And I really hope that you really get us engaged. And every now and again, I might interrupt you. I'll be pleasant about it if I feel like you really need to give us a bit more. But take it over.
Thank you very much, Chikane. I would want to start by doing a bit of some acknowledgements. I want to first start by thanking the SRC under the leadership of Mr. Akha Tutu, the management of the University of Cape Town for putting together this very timely event. And I think that more importantly for also extending to me this invitation to share my perspectives and my thoughts on such an important discussion as the one that we've picked. I would also want to say a few kind words about Ms. Asanda Lubelo, the immediate past SRC president of UCT, for the various contributions she's made to the advancement of the continental students' struggle. I would want to end my acknowledgement by also thanking all students. It's been a very difficult time, and student leaders, student movements all over the world have risen up to the challenge. They have stood up and in very diverse ways and contributed to alleviating the toll of the pandemic. Just a few of the things that students have done. Some of them in various ways have partnered with their universities, and I do know that in South Africa, for example, most of the student SRCs partnered to produce PPEs, sanitizers, equipment, etc. to give out. Some of them also, at the peril of their lives, also in diverse ways went out there, volunteered, gave food out, did so many things. I do hope that, I mean, when all of the pandemic passes and everything is over, we will not forget what young people did, what students stood up to do. The subject matter that we have for today is an important one. We're looking at student voices and actions and what does the future look like. I would want to perhaps take us a bit back. I mean, to understand what the future looks like, it's important that we step back to look at what the past has been and what our various contributions has equally been. UCT has a rather interesting history when it comes to its role to the fight for independence for South Africa, and then consequently against the apartheid regime. In recent times, UCT has been the birthplace for movements that has gained global renown, like the Fees Must Fall, and then some anti-colonialist movements. You would realize that the university continues to play a very catalytic role towards the advancement of the socio-economic development in South Africa. And so it doesn't come as a surprise to me that UCT has begun the conversations to see how the post-COVID world would look like and what critical space that young people should occupy, especially students, by way of leading the way to make the discussions known and to shape it as we've done in the past. Two ways that I see that we can discuss this is that, one, COVID-19 has exposed the stark inequalities in our social structures. And this has further exacerbated the impact on marginalized children, the fight for gender equality. We're talking about something around 11 million young girls who would potentially not go back to the classrooms when school reopens. We're equally talking about a combined total of around 24 million students who may not go back to school. But why? We know that the economic impact of the COVID has meant that a lot of caregivers have lost their jobs. Most of them cannot sustain paying tuition fees, facility, academic user fees as we go back to school. And so if we understand the context of the impact that COVID has made, then it begs the question of, if we look at the past and we look at the various roles that students have played up to this point, where we as young people are benefiting from the toils, the sweat, the blood of the people who are our forebears, it makes absolute sense to ask the question that, what would we also want to do to be able to make the future better for those who would come after us? And so my thoughts are this, that on a very key thing, as a continent, especially in Africa, we do know that projections indicate that by 2050, Africa would potentially be the continent with the largest youth population. Now, that also has an implication on unemployment. And so as young people, how do we begin to contextualize these backgrounds to look at what role we have to play to make it possible for the future to be a better one? And so I have looked at a number of things that I believe that as students we can contribute. And it starts with looking at the future of education. What kind of education framework do we want? How does that impact us? And so two things that I would say, because I'm realizing that I'm running a bit out of time. So I do think that we need to move from a teacher-centered approach of learning to a student-centered approach of learning. We know that knowledge has been massified. In fact, it's been commoditized in such a way that everybody has access to information just by picking a cell phone in. So it makes sense that we'll begin to readjust and look back at how we have instructed in the classroom. To what extent has that been beneficial in shaping us to be the sort of change agents that we should be? If it's anything at all, the World Economic Forum report does suggest that in the future we're going to be looking at potentially two classifications of job structures. So we're looking at a higher end of the structure and then a lower end. That means that the middle end is sort of wiped out. If you take a case of Uber, for example, the high end would be those people who maybe write the codes, they deal with the algorithms, etc. And then you have the drivers at the lower end. If you look at the paycheck difference between a driver at Uber and then maybe somebody who writes a code, the difference is so exponential. Now, that means that the wiping away of the middle bracket would mean that as young people, we're going to be dealing with a different future of work. It also means that how we're educated, are we going to continue the format of education or we're going to decolonize it? It also means that we must begin to look at, we've been home, we've been learning, and we realize that it's not the same way as when we are in school. And so yes, even as we move forward, much as it's an opportunity for us to look at online learning and the opportunities it comes with, it's also an opportunity to look at how we can blend it. So rather than saying that let's have an absolute online learning opportunities, there should be that young people should advance and students should advance for more of blended learning. And why do I think that blended learning is important? We know that there's a social dimension of education. So when we go to school, the whole idea is not just to go and accumulate knowledge. There's the networking opportunity which we need, which is an enormous capital that we can leverage on in the next couple of years. If we were to wipe out that possibility to network in our education period, that would mean that we're losing a significant capital in the future. So one of the things that we might have to do is to advocate that rather than do straight online learning, perhaps one of the ways that we could go is to look at it in terms of blended learning. Then the other thing that maybe I'll share, because I'm realizing that I just have 2 minutes more, is that we may want to begin to look at a shift in how our education system is structured. And so off my head and the number of times I've been involved in curriculum design, we're trying to incorporate humanity into the sort of learning that we're instructed. And so, yes, I mean, do we just get knowledge, or we want to get knowledge to which people can use with compassion? You'd realize that, I mean, the impact of COVID has been such that it has shown how racial systems are, how xenophobic it can be. At the same time, too, it has shown that people can show love. Companies have had to stop, some big, companies have had to stop to produce PPEs, sanitizers, etc., not for profit, but so that humanity can survive. And so at the heart of our learning, we need to be able to realize that as we move the world forward, there has to be humanity embedded in the education that we actually give out. And then lastly, we need to also redefine our learning to include a problem-solving approach. What it is that we do not come out of school to find a job waiting for us. That opportunity was there for our fathers and our mothers. It appears that we do not have a luxury like that. So to what extent will the sort of instruction that we receive make us have the skill set and the competence to fit into a world that is no longer flat, that is no longer predictable, it's volatile, it's agile. So how, to what extent are our skill sets, our competences able to adapt to a world like that? And so perhaps just to stay in time, this would be my initial thoughts. And I do think that when there's an opportunity to make interventions, I'll share my other thoughts. So thank you very much. And I've done 10 minutes on the clock.
Thanks, Peter. I love it when speakers stick on time and are very conscious of that. I mean, you've made some fantastic points, and one that I think we'll definitely return to a bit later is this notion of how do you have a governance of love, right? A world of love, and a company that espouses the idea of love for humanity in a time of crisis such as this. And I hope you can touch on that a bit more. I just want to note, please do use the question tab for those who are participating. We will publish your questions. We're going to get to them all at the end. But I would really encourage you to get the questions rolling, and all our panelists will get back to you towards the end of today. So I want to hand it over to our next speaker, Larissa Kennedy. If you can take over and tell us about your experiences and your ideas about the opportunities available to us around how we change this world and take advantage of our situation.
Thanks so much, and thanks to UCT for convening this space. It really is a joy and a privilege to hear from student organisers from different parts of the world, and particularly so for me because today marks the first day of Black History Month in the UK. And throughout this month, every year, the student movement here spends time reflecting on the history of Black students' activism, reckoning with the lived realities of anti-Black racism that we face in the present, and radically rearranging the future of education through the lens of Black liberation. And the politics and praxis of this work they are now and must always be inherently internationalist. But you know, this is why this space is so perfect, a perfect way to begin my Black History Month amongst several Black student organisers in listening to and absorbing their imaginations of what's to come. And as we all kind of answer that question that we've been posed on this panel, what does the future look like? And in answering that question myself, I think I'd like to carve out two sub-questions, if I may. The first being, what does the future of education look like? And the second, how can that have a ripple impact on the rest of the world? Because for us here in the UK, this global pandemic has further exposed the awful underbelly of the marketised education system here. We currently have thousands of students across the country locked in halls, struggling to access food, to access toiletries and other basic amenities because our government and our universities prioritise collecting tuition fees and rent income ahead of student safety. In response to this horrific experience and countless others related to the ways that our unis run like businesses, our movement will be driving a campaign to create a new vision for education. One that believes that students deserve better. One that builds on the principles that our education system should be fully funded, truly accessible and lifelong. And a vision that believes education should be shaped by students, staff and communities. Here in the UK, we need to reconceive what and who our education system is for. And building on these principles, we will move towards a future where we truly value our education as a public good, and create a system that allows people to re-enter education whenever they need to. So over the next few years, we'll be building localized campaigns and a network of students and student representatives here who are ready to take action. And we'll be looking to organise in solidarity with friends and allies around the world who are seeking to bring this vision to life too. But this isn't the only change we see as fundamental to the future of our education. We're also fighting for liberated education, and over the past few years, we've seen the power of the student movement to decolonise education in the UK consistently growing, much of which was sparked by the Rhodes Must Fall movement, led by student organisers at UCT. So over the next couple of years, the student movement in the UK will also be building a national decolonisation network, one that will build on years of work led by Black and Brown student organisers, and will grow this movement from strength to strength, because we see that the future of this movement will be in establishing the next generation of anti-racist campaigners and coalitions of activists who can work together to decolonise our universities and colleges. Because we're in quite a unique position in the UK, where the universities we have are the very product of colonialism, and we want to grasp at the very root of this structural injustice. We've been exhausted by equality and diversity work here that attempts to glaze over these fundamental flaws rather than redressing the power imbalances inherent to our institutions and colleges and universities. We're seeking to empower students at the grassroots to establish a new system of education built on decolonial practice, but also to build spaces for ourselves as Black folks outside of the academy, where we can entirely transform the landscape of education and knowledge production. And that's why, in addition to my role at NUS, I'm also part of the team at the Free Black University, also known as FBU, which is a Black-led hub for radical and transformative knowledge production. The fight to decolonise education continues to be incredibly important at the institutions that we're at, but it's also becoming ever clearer to us that more is required than the current education system can potentially ever offer. Universities hold a deep responsibility when it comes to racism, and we know that, the knowledge that introduced the very ideology of racism into our society was in part born in UK universities. So we are building the FBU to redistribute knowledge and to act as a space of incubation for the creation of transformative knowledge in the Black community specifically, and in a way that is at its core free, anti-colonial and accessible to all, but also that centres the healing of Black people and that engages critical thought in the wider mission for liberation and freedom. Because we're well aware that the world is ever changing, and the thought leaders of the next generation need deep and transformational spaces to develop their thinking in the face of the present challenges. And we also hope and intend that this work will show universities all over the world just what can be done when the revolutionary agenda of Black liberation is at the heart of building spaces that produce knowledge and teach. So I guess that leads into my second sub-question, which was really around how that has a ripple impact on the world and the kind of society that we live in. Well, I think if everything goes to plan, then the future is transformative. It's beyond the constructs of the academy, and to be honest, it's things that are still forming in our imaginations. It's a new normal shaped by people-powered, student-powered organising that really exists at the grassroots and belongs to the grassroots, but also that exists beyond and resists the existence of borders in spaces much like these, where we're connecting with student organisers across the world. And it's also a world where we've uprooted the oppression, the marginalisation born of and reproduced by this world to build anew. I've been reflecting recently on the fact that, many campaign theorists have recognised that we're living through what's often referred to as the moment of the whirlwind, a time of crisis that spawns opportunities for mass social change. And I know that the global student movement is powerful enough to seize those opportunities and through the whirlwind, see the glimmer of a new future. And I know that that world is not only possible, she is well on her way. And on some of the quieter days in lockdown, one pattern has been loud and clear. I've seen friends who usually shrug at politics turning up to protests, family members who usually don't want to discuss what's going on in the world talking about reimagining justice, people on social media who I wouldn't expect to, critiquing government's responses to the global pandemic. And in each of these moments, I could almost hear that whirlwind building, knocking at power's door, not only in relation to education, but also in relation to much of the rest of the world. You see, that's the power of the student movement, that's the power of the youth movement. When we speak, when we act, it has a ripple impact. It's like when a drop of water, it drops, but you see the ripples further than you can even see, further than you can even capture. And so as we, as a student movement, the global student movement, the global youth movement, are seizing and grasping at the root of injustice, grasping at the root of oppression, grasping at the root of marginalization in this moment, as we face one of the greatest crises we could ever imagine, the world will follow, because those ripple impacts are inevitable. Those ripple impacts are each and every one of us. Each conversation that we're having, each time we're organizing and mobilizing students, each time we're empowering students to believe that they really can transform the world, that ripples out. And that's where our power lies. So as a student movement, we will continue to be radical, to be visionary, and to build a grassroots mass movement capable of realizing not only the vision that we have for education, but the vision that we have for the future of the world. And we're building that from the rubble of the old. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larissa. That was amazing. I mean, I definitely do want to push you, maybe not right now, because you made this fantastic point of this whirlwind of change. And the one thing that you really come across is, you know, it's easy to find yourself in the whirlwind, but it's extremely difficult to take advantage of it, to steer the whirlwind in the manner that you want it to go. And the problem about our society and capitalism is that it has this stubborn habit of bringing us back to the status quo, a stubborn habit of refusing to change, even though change looks so obvious. So I love that metaphor, and I might just take it from you, just so you know. So thank you for that. But I do want us to move on to the next speaker, but I want you to keep that at the back of your mind. But we're going to move on to our next speaker. If Esther's here, I know she's just come on. If Ester, you can take over and give us your brilliant response to the question posed.
Good evening, everybody. Allow me to stand on the protocol that has already been established. Before I move into my presentation, I know I have 10 minutes. I don't know if I'll be able to do justice to this broad topic, but all in all, thank you so much to the organizers of this very brilliant event. I think it's really important that as young people and as students, we ought to have a dialogue of the future and be able to contribute to what it is that we think is very important to shape the future moving forward. Now, for today's dialogue or today's panel discussion, really, I feel that as panelists, our role is quite extensive, and that's to look in terms of the content of the challenges that were posed by COVID-19, as well as the lessons learned and what it is that we feel we can take away in terms of getting ready and preparing better next time. And the most important, which I think is my favorite part of the presentation, is our role as young people in shaping the future. Now, without any further ado, is for us to note that COVID-19 has really pressed all of us with diverse challenges in all areas, and I've tried to classify them into 3 sectors. Firstly, the educational challenges. Secondly, economic challenges, and lastly, social challenges. But just a broader perspective is that we've seen that with COVID-19, with the closure of educational institutions, were pressed with limited access, especially students, with regards to facilities, which ultimately made learning very difficult. And in most cases, especially to those that are coming from less privileged backgrounds, education was really just not impossible. They were not able to learn at all. But apart from the obvious benefits that comes with education, we've also been able to see that young people or students and learners also press or the honor or the extra activities that happen at school or extra social programs in terms of assistance, such as be it the school feeding programs, be it the sanitary assistance in school, were also disrupted, and these have pressed young people and students quite extensively. With regard to the economic challenges, I would want to just highlight, and I've seen it's evident enough with regard to the economical growth, which has been contracted, especially around the issues of unemployment that went very high, people losing their jobs. COVID left a lot of families without any source of income, and thus really brought a lot of challenges, not only to young people, but I think also just to people in general, because now you have a family to take care of and there is little to no income at all. With regards to social challenges, we've seen an increase in gender-based violence. We've seen a challenge with regards to mental health issues, and also hunger and poverty has been a challenge as well. But with that said, then what is it that I felt from our side is a key takeaway, or what are the lessons that we've learned, and what do we need to do to ensure that we're better prepared for next time? I've also again tried to break this down into 3 concepts, and the first one is the healthcare system. If there is something which is a threat to mankind, which COVID has really pressed on, is the health sector. And there's a lot of effort from my side that I think we can take away from, is to ensure that we are better prepared for next time. There's a lot of resources that needs to be channeled into our health system. There's a lot of budgeting that needs to be done, especially planning. We need to start planning much more to ensure that in a next outbreak or moving forward, we are better prepared and our health systems are able to cater for the needs of our people. Secondly is the importance of technology. For quite some time, I felt, especially myself, I've overrated the aspect of technology. I felt just by having a laptop and a cell phone that has access to data, I'm sorted. But COVID has given or proven to us that it's actually not like that. We need to sort of put much more emphasis on technological development in our nations, in our states. But then with regards to technological development, it's just not only that we need to invest in buying resources or infrastructure, but we need to invest much more in capacity building. Because I, for one, as a student, I still had to learn my way around Zoom app applications. I had to find my way around even the Teams, Microsoft Teams that we're using now. So there is a need, a deliberate need that we need to put pressure on, and that capacity building for us as students and young people in general to be much more literate around digital technology, because I think it is the current and it is the future moving forward. But most importantly, what I feel has pressed us with regards to technology is our rural areas and our people in our rural areas, students and learners. We've seen that now COVID has sort of pressed an agency for education to be online, but this was not feasible because we have those that are deep down in rural areas where networks is a challenge, where access to these applications is a challenge, even access to the devices for them to be able to go online is another challenge as well. So in that, I feel moving forward is one of the direct needs that we need to ensure that moving forward, we do give direct capacity building with regards to technology. We invest much more in infrastructure and really just focus on digital development, because I believe, or I think that if we are better capacitated as students or as young people, we wouldn't have had a bigger challenge in terms of even contact tracing. We would have been having young people being innovative, coming up with applications that can assist in contact tracing, where we can probably do online bookings for COVID-19 tests, but we were unable to do so because I feel we are not well capacitated as students and young people around the digital technology and so forth. And I also feel, as of now, it's very safe to say that the 4th Industrial Revolution is fast and steadily upon us, and we need to act, and we need to act now. The third sector that I feel is also very important to touch on with the challenges that COVID-19 has pressed and the lessons that we've learned is the education sector. Particularly, I've phrased this into 2 sections, the formal education and the informal education. And I would like to also acknowledge the former speakers or panelists have also really touched on this, and that's the need for a reviewed and a decolonized education system, where we have an education system that speaks directly to our current needs, an education system that address the direct issues that our people are facing, an education system which is reformed, which is well structured to really speak to the needs of our generation, to speak to the needs of our people. But ultimately, all of this is really underlined in the urgency or the need for us to look into curriculum reviews, curriculum reforms, and decolonizing our education system, because it's now really about time for us to ensure that we produce a consistent world-class and regional education system by ensuring that we decolonize the current system or the current educational system that we have, because it needs to be inclusive, it needs to speak to the status quo, and it really needs to address the current dynamics and speak to our own struggle. In addition to that, with regards to the informal education, I believe it's about time that we need to also start addressing the structural inequalities to ensure that we have quality in terms of informal education, and that it cuts equally across all sectors. Our urban areas and our rural areas need to have equal access to both education in terms of formal and informal, for us to be able to disseminate equal information around these sectors per se. Now, moving into my favorite section of my presentation is really addressing or speaking towards the roles of students and young people in shaping the future that it is that you want. Now, firstly, I feel it's very important for us as young people and as student leaders and students in general to be active participants. And by being active participants is generally being the voice of the voiceless, speaking out, speaking truth to power, and really just addressing challenges by sharing our views, our opinions with relation to shaping the future and sharing innovative and new ideas for addressing global challenges. It becomes a challenge for me when I feel as young people we're sort of idled or we are laid back by contributing to global or generational challenges that we see. And it's really our role as young people to make sure that we actively participate in ensuring that the future that it is that we envisioned is shaped, and we are the ones that are shaping it, because at the end of the day, we are the ones that know how we want it to look like. So we need to start shaping it by contributing directly as of right now. Secondly, as young people, it's very important for us to speak truth to power by redressing and addressing the triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and structural inequalities. It is our role and it rests upon our shoulders as young people to actively participate in that regard. Moving forward, I feel it's also about time as young people and students to be able to identify our generational agenda. When we gather, for instance, a dialogue such as this one, what is it that we have in common? What is it that we are advocating for? What is it that we are championing that is currently positive, and we are trying to shape it moving forward to ensure that the future we envision today is going to materialize? So we need to identify our generational mandate, our generational call, and once we identify that generational mandate and agenda, then we start actively, collectively working towards achieving that, and working together without any fear of favor, and achieving the generational mandate will become a reality if we are able to collaborate and work together. But the first step is to identify our generational mandate, especially in the areas of education and shaping our future or shaping the future moving forward. In addition, again, is by occupying space. I feel at times everywhere when young people gather or when young people are on a panel, then we speak a lot about young people are taking up space, young people are, occupying space without any fear of favor, but it's about time we make it very practical. We just do not need to continue sloganing or speaking about taking up space, but we do not see practical realities or practical examples where young people are taking up space. And when we take up this space, we practically and actively contribute to shaping the future. We actively contribute to ensuring that whatever it is that we're trying to have a discourse on is to contribute to a bigger generational agenda, is to contribute to a bigger mandate or to a bigger picture, be it regionally, locally, or even globally, as they say. But most importantly, when we take up this space, I'm very passionate about policies, and I feel one of the biggest interventions that we as young people can contribute is by influencing different policies. But then these different policies, we need to directly and consciously contribute towards them to ensure that when they do materialize, they are in the interest of the future that it is that we are envisioning. Moving towards the end, it's also about us being the voice of the voiceless, tangibly advocating and lobbying for international and regional as well as local support for aspects in the interest of shaping the desired future, especially in the areas of education. I feel as young people, again, our role is really to be able to speak truth to power, to be able to even voice out on behalf of the others and voice out on behalf of the voiceless. But when we voice out now, what is it that we're making noise about? What is it that we're voicing out about? Ultimately, for me, it's about shaping the future, or bringing into reality, into practical practices, a future that we envision for ourselves. But ultimately, it's us as young people taking up key space and ensuring that when we contribute to these policies, when we take up these platforms, when we lead discourses, we are able to shape the future that it is that we want. Now, in general, as young people, I feel we should be innovative. We should be taking lead of discourses that are in the interest of shaping the future, be it at formal settings or non-formal settings. And one of the aspects that I feel is very important, and young people have really seen the power of it right now, is social media. If at all social media has brought any advantages, is one where young people can actively participate in discourses, national, regional, local discourses, which can bring about positive and accurate change, be it with regards to policy influencing, be it with regards to just shaping the future in general, but most importantly around student activism. We've really been having social media as one of our tools, one of our babies, where we are able to use to shape or to bring upon a positive change, which it is that we want to advocate for. And there's a phrase, I don't know if it's also elsewhere, but in Namibia, where some people are labeled as social media activists. And I feel probably the only analytical view from my end is that in order for us to attach importance to that, is to ensure that our social media activism is added together with practical activism. Then when we combine the two, then I would believe that we are able to do a lot of magic. Now, in wrapping up, I would like to touch on the vision of a future education system that I envision or that I want to see, and that is an education system which is relevant, an education system which is decolonized, an education system which addresses our own issues and our own struggles of our own people. But at the end of the day, this education system should be accessible to every Namibian child, to every global, continental, to every deserving child, whereby it's free. And when we mean free, it's free and quality education in our lifetime. I would like to end my presentation with an African proverb, which states that where you sit when you are old shows where you stood in your youth, which ultimately means that where you will be standing now in your youth will show where you will sit in your old age days. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Esther. I mean, you hit on so many different points, and the one I just want to highlight is this notion of, students and young people taking their place in society. And there's a phrase that some people at UCT will know I used to say all the time, that I hated when people say that young people are apathetic. It really grates my soul when I hear that, because I say just because you're not interesting young people in the right way doesn't mean that they're apathetic. And when you look at the history of youth activism and youth protests, you can go all the way back down to ancient Egypt, where there's now research that showcases how young people in ancient Egypt were trying to take up space in that society, right? This is not a new thing of us taking up space. It is the norm that young people play in our society. So I love that notion. And I also want us to dig in a bit deeper into this notion of how do we decolonize our world? How do we decolonize our educational system? What does that actually mean for our society and what are the benefits for it? But before I get ahead of myself, I want to hand over to our next speaker, who I think it's still morning there. I'm not sure. It might be midday now, but I'm going to hand over to Carolina Pavanelli.
It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here now. So good afternoon. First of all, I want to thank UCT for the invitation. Well, so much has been said so far, so many insightful ideas about the future in regard to education, social problems, and especially the role of students as the leaders, not only of the future, but also leaders of the present. So let me introduce myself very briefly. My name is Carolina Pavanelli. I've been an educator for as long as I can remember now, and I am from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So I'm on the other side of the world. For over 10 years now, I've been a high school teacher. I teach rhetoric and writing, and I also work on developing curriculums for schools all over the country. So Very recently in Brazil, we had the publication of the new National Common Core and also a huge high school reform proposal, two very, very important things in our educational landscape. But little did we know, or anyone else, that a virus of pandemic proportions would come and change all of our plans and make us think one more time about what is a priority and what really matters in terms of what our students should learn and what kind of citizens we would like them to be, or the future generations to be. So for me, it's very hard to talk about the future in such a harsh scenario. And I'm not just referring to the coronavirus pandemic, but also, for example, political and environmental crisis, gender bias, and let's not forget about the very, very strong polarization we see all over the world. There's a book that I like a lot called How Democracies Die. It's a New York Times best-selling book. It was written by two Harvard political scientists professors, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And they defend that the more polarized a society is, the more dangerous it is for its democracy. Because once we see our rival as a rival, we tend to try to be better so we can beat them. But once we see our rivals as enemies, they become a threat and we tend to try to eliminate them. So it is very, very dangerous. And from where I see, it's precisely the students' voices that are going to be vital to maintain and protect our democracies all around the globe. And the best way to do so is through education. So I know it's not my place to give a statement on the situation in schools or in education in general throughout the whole Latin America, not even the entire country of Brazil, since it's a continental country. It's a country of continental proportions. Here we have enormous social and economic differences. For you to have an idea, 10% of the wealthiest Brazilians concentrate 43% of the national income. It's too much in the hands of just a few. And of course, this reflects on education. During the lockdown caused by COVID-19, over 4 million students spent months with no classes at all. And why am I saying this? Because for me, without a proper education, our sense of democracy and citizenship shrinks. And there is no way to have a good-looking future world without it. So one thing that I did not say about me in the beginning was I'm a master's student, and my research for my master's degree is about teaching citizenship in basic education. So since the beginning, one of the hardest things for me was to somehow create a specific way to address such a broad subject, because citizenship is so many things, and that's the beauty about it. But why talk about citizenship to face the future? Well, to briefly answer this, I'll consider 3 paths for education in citizenship that I discovered during my research when it comes to citizenship at schools, with the participation of students and putting students in the center of the learning process. So path number 1 is social and environmental citizenship. So we all know how important it is to preserve the environment. This goes without saying. But for me, there is no separation between taking care of the air we breathe, or of our forests or our oceans, and taking care of public health, for example, or public education, for example. We are all people connected with nature. We are all the future, both people and nature combined. But right now, as we speak, over 23% of Brazilians' wetland that we call Pantanal has been burned. Maybe you've seen this on the news. Pantanal is a natural region encompassing the world's largest tropical wetland area and the world's largest flooded grasslands. It is the greatest devastation of Brazilian history and affects the climate of the entire planet. And we see no effective action being taken by the authorities or the government. As a society, of course, we cry over the devastated species. We are saddened by the animals that we will never get to see again, but we don't see what we can do about it. And I think it comes to education. I believe that if we taught environmental awareness and environmental citizenship since early childhood, maybe we would, and maybe the future generations will. Path number two, it's digital citizenship. In 2019, a United Nations report showed that 51% of the world's population has internet access. It's almost 4 billion people online. It's a lot of people. And once again, one thing that the coronavirus pandemic showed us, and it has been said here before, is how education needs to be in sync with technology and with the internet. Millions of students all around the globe were able to keep learning because of it. And yes, we know that the internet is full of rich possibilities, but it's also a place filled with violence and prejudice, fake news, and cyberbullying. So if the online world is here to stay, if it is going to be more and more a part of our lives, both now and in the future, I believe we should teach in schools how to behave and how to be a good citizen, both offline and online. And last but not least, path number three is global citizenship. One of the United Nations Millennium Development Goals is to develop a global partnership. In a globalized world, there is no way we can achieve this if we keep looking inward and not outward. Being a global citizen does not necessarily mean that we must travel all around the globe, getting to know different cultures. It's amazing. I would love to go to South Africa one day, but we know that traveling around the globe is not trivial. But it is also, for me, being a global citizen, it is also thinking about the world in an empathic way, with empathic lenses, acknowledging that even with our individualities, that they are important, of course, we are one. I mean, what happens in Pantanal echoes all around the globe. We are one. And it goes beyond history or geography lessons. It is also about social emotional learning and working together. I think my time is almost up. So I want to once again thank UCT for the opportunity, and well, hopefully I was able to get you thinking about how to develop citizenship in education, or at least start this conversation in order to make a better future for us all. So, obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. That was fantastic. I mean, you made these 2 points I just want to touch on before I open it up to the questions. And you had mentioned the notion of what is the future of citizenship, and the nature of citizenship in a changing, globalized world, and increasingly digitalized world, where 30 years from now, what will be our borders? What will be the concept of a nation state? And if the concept of a nation state starts disappearing, what does that mean for youth activism at that point? Do we coalesce together? Do we come together? Or do we separate and go back into our own corners? And there's another point that a lot of people talk about decolonization as like this homogenous exercise. In fact, decolonization can be very different in different corners of the world. And the South American experience, that notion of bien vivir, that living well, that notion that decolonization is intrinsically linked to the environment and protecting the environment and being part of that. And I would want more people to read up on it because I think it's a fantastic developmental model. But I am not one of the panelists, so I cannot wax lyrical. We have a ton of questions, and please, as we go along, I'm going to take in more questions. I'm going to give the first one to Larissa. And Larissa, there's 2 questions I want to pose to you from the floor, for lack of an actual floor, but from the floor. So the first one I want you to address is this question of, you know, what is the role of, in this COVID-19, of universal basic education? The person who asked the question is anonymous on my screen, but they asked, what's the role of universal basic universal basic income in particular? The Secretary General of the UN at the Nelson Mandela lecture this year came out for the first time. I've never heard an SG of the UN ever say this, and said there's a need for universal basic income. How does that fit in the world now? And the second question I want to pose to you, also from the chat, is, and this was from another anonymous individual, but I think it's important. What is the role of white students and white young activists in the project of decolonization? How do they fit within it? How do they become white allies in leadership? So if you can address those first two questions.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And I think they're both really, really interesting questions. In relation to universal basic income, I think this kind of resurgence of a movement that's rejecting the idea that anyone should have to live in poverty, rejecting the idea that we should have the kind of steep stratification of income levels that we do around the world, around the globe at the moment, is really speaks to the ways that, you know, as young people, as students, we're moving towards a more equitable, a more just vision of the world. We're moving towards pushing for a world where, you know, no one should have to suffer because they don't have the income that month or that year or in that circumstance. And, you know, we in the UK have seen this situation where such a vast kind of a section of our society are only one paycheck away from being below the poverty line. And that reality is one that I know that so many around the world are experiencing. And so I think the kind of rising pressure around the need for universal basic income is one that is well warranted and one that will result in a win, I believe, for ensuring that everyone has access to resources that they need, not only to survive, but to thrive. And I think as we continue to see pressure piled on for this, that young people and students will again be at the helm of this movement and of making this a reality. So I think really welcome the question around UBI and think that this is something that's definitely going to be won in the near future, I hope. And then in relation to the question about the role of white students in decolonisation, I think there's a primary role, and I want to say this first and foremost, to listen, because I think the work of decolonisation is, of course, something that must centre the voices of those who have lived experience of what colonial legacy and the neo-colonial present impact as people of colour. And so, of course, the role of white students has to first and foremost be to listen and to learn from those who have those lived experiences. And I think that kind of also lends itself to a question about allyship and what that really means, because I think it's often thrown around as a noun that people can attach to themselves. But I also want to remind people that to ally is a verb. And it's something that people have to actively do every single day. And it, I think, involves a process of both unlearning and learning, because there's so much to unpack in the ways that we've been socialized to subscribe to colonialism and neo-colonialism, not only at the structural level, which of course has lots to unpack, but also on an interpersonal level. And so I think that there is a work to do the unlearning necessary to make the verb to ally possible for white students. But equally, I think there's a lot to learn in regards to the role of allies and how to do that in a way that, as I say, centres those who have that lived experience and also recognises the ways that racism is being reproduced every single day, not only by the systems and structures that we sit within in our universities and colleges, but also by those interpersonal interactions. And I think, you know, when I was at my local union, at my university itself, before taking on the national role, I did a piece of research around the experiences of students of colour when it came to both racism and anti-racism, and finding that some of the most harrowing experiences of students were at the hands and the words of other white students, and seeing the role of allies in stepping up and intervening in really changing what is and isn't considered normal and acceptable and then also in helping organise to build the student-powered movements necessary to really shift the conversation around decolonisation into a space of tangible action. So I hope that kind of comprehensively answers both those questions. I do actually have to apologise and say I'm due to leave early, so I probably won't be able to answer any more, but thank you so much for allowing me to answer those two, and thank you also for having me, because it's been a really, really amazing event, and I'll be watching how the rest of it goes afterwards on the recording.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us and giving us such insightful opinions and views. And good luck. I hope you watch the recording. There might be more questions that come your way, and hopefully we can get a way of getting your answers to those participants. I do want to move to Peter, because we haven't seen you for a while, so I want to bring you back into the conversation. And there's two questions for Peter that I kind of want you to deal with. And one question that came from the floor is this notion of how do you move student leadership and student activism into party political processes, and whether that translation can actually happen. And the second question was really posed of, what do you think are the responsibilities and duties, the responsibilities and duties of African student leaders over the next year, especially after COVID-19? I'm paraphrasing the question, but it's that role of what is the notion of the AASU essentially over the next year after COVID-19. And as I said, the first one, what's the role of student leadership moving towards political parties? Is that available? Is that a space they should pursue? Is it important? Should they stay as student leaders? How do they not avoid being swallowed up by political parties, etc.?
All right. I think that for the first one, I seem to think that there is a natural trajectory from when you are a student leader, and then subsequently when you seem to sort of transition into national leadership. And so if you look at our landscape, it is obvious that, I mean, most of the leaders that we do have presently were groomed at the student leadership level. And so then it begs the question of, if we have corrupt leaders, if we have leaders who don't care, is it that they picked all of these things while they were in the student leadership circles? If the answer is yes, then it means that we must begin to remodel the sort of ways that we're grooming our young people, our student leaders. And so it really tells us that we need to begin to, as it were, socialize our students into acceptable norms. So to what extent are we preparing them to fill the leadership spaces, both in the present and then in the future? But I think from where I sit, that on account of what we've seen in the past, there is that clear trajectory where it will appear that almost everybody who goes through this cycle, if they have a shot at doing it at the national level, it will appear that they come with the relevant skill set, the experience, the competences to do that. However, the question of if our governments are being run the way they are being run and it's not good enough, and the question is that in the past, all of these people have been through student leadership experiences, then what kind of experiences have they had in the past? And so one of the things that we have been doing as All Africa Students Union is building capacity. And I think that someone to us asked a question, and just maybe, let me just, what kind of skills do student leaders need? And so one of the key things that I've said is that you need to be able to develop the appropriate knowledge which is relevant to your current position. It helps you to be able to negotiate properly. It helps you to be able to understand the context that you're dealing with, to exhibit, I mean, cultural intelligence, social intelligence, be able to deal with the spaces that you find yourself in. At the same time, too, I linked to my earlier point of embedding humanity in our learning systems, there's that thing of compassion. And I think that a lot more of what we have seen, especially in the COVID times, you would see, as much as we've seen, I mean, incidences where people are showing extreme tendencies to discriminate, to show racial tendencies. We've also seen those same tendencies of people showing love, people showing care, people standing up and showing people that you can't be there to support them. But this doesn't come by itself. People must be socialized into those kind of norms. And so I For me, I said, as the All Africa Students Union, I think that we have a critical role to play as that institution that is continental in nature and has that core mandate to, as it were, shape student leaders to be the kind that we want. We must begin to now look at the sort of future that we want. What has the past done for us, and then what do we want as young people to do for the next generation? And if it's an account of that, then I think that a lot of the programs that we're running currently would show that we're taking a lot of these things by way of compassion, by way of the issues that we believe matter. And one of the key things that we're doing currently is making sure that girls go back to school. And so one of the things that we're running on a continent-wide scale is running the Girls Back to School campaign in partnership with UNESCO. The other thing too that we're doing is that we realize that young people, children, are not impacted in the same way during this COVID times. Pre-COVID, an estimated 200 million children were out of school. As we begin to go back into school, those numbers, we risk increasing those numbers by an exponential rate. So one of the things that we've also done is to leverage on our convening power to reach out to decision makers to create a new social contract. It's an opportunity to tear down the existing structures, because we've seen, like I've said, COVID has exposed those stark inequalities. So if it is clear that what we see, the prevailing structures are unequal, then it means that we need to tear them down and then redesign a structure that is equal, that gives everybody the opportunity to have a decent shot at life. So I do think that if we approach a number of things from these point of views, then I do think that we'll have an opportunity as young people to shape a future that is better, not just for us, but those who come after us. And so these are my thoughts, but I do think that if time permits, and maybe afterwards, I'll be willing to share a couple of the reports that we've worked on and some of the interventions that we've made. It's been a good opportunity. As I see it, when it started, I didn't think that we'd be able to do what we have done, because it hit everybody. But I also saw that young people began to be innovative. They began to respond in so many ways that I hadn't imagined that would have the wherewithal to do that. And so it challenged us, and we responded positively. And so on the note that I would conclude, I would say that we're going to continue to demand accountability from our leaders, because that is our convening power. The fact that we can build solidarity across borders, we can build solidarity at the international level, means that we can live, because our problems are common. They are common. As we say that they are intersectional. So if they are common to us, then it means that it makes sense to be able to build solidarity among those common themes, and then build a response that is equal globally. Because as we've seen it, what affects a country somewhere you think that it's not your business, eventually becomes your business. And so that's perhaps something that I would want to leave with us, to see that we're in a globalized world and our approaches must take a global dimension.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. And you touched on so many important things, and one that I really want us to kind of hatch on, and hopefully I can make sure we have time so you can share that information with us, is often as student leaders, we fall into the trap of working in our own shell, as if the problems that we're facing are not global or international or continental. And there's this need, and I really want to urge as many people to reach out to the ASU, to really build these lines of solidarity, to learn strategy and tactics of what might not have worked in South Africa might work in Ghana or Nigeria, and really opening that up. I want to push on to Ester. And Ester, you touched on a few points, and there's a question here, not from Anonymous, but from Jennifer, who asked that she's curious about how we've coped. So this is for you, Ester. She's curious of how we've coped with our studies during COVID-19. And you had talked about that transition that a lot of students had to make, right? That digital divide that a lot of people had to kind of jump over. What are the lessons that we've learned on how we can perhaps change our educational systems going forward post-corona? And then the other question she asks is this notion of decolonizing research methodologies within the university. And you had talked a lot about, the need to decolonize our curriculum, the need to decolonize our spaces. And how do you envision that working out in our societies in a manner that actually promotes globally South voices? So the two questions is, what are the lessons we should learn in our educational system post-corona? And how do we solve the gaps that were created? And the second question is, what are the decolonizing research methodologies we should be utilizing that help amplify global South voices?
All right, thank you very much for the questions. I feel if there's anything at all that we've learned from COVID-19 and how us as young people were able to cope, it just goes back as an underlining factor of how serious we take education as young people. And there isn't any extra magic that came to ensure that we really did cope, because students were struggling with a lot of issues. Because remember, number one, the issue of access is already a challenge, not only nationally, I would like to believe it's continental and also globally, where you have students coming from vast backgrounds, some especially those from less privileged backgrounds, where when we talk about access to a textbook, they are sharing textbooks, even at varsity or institutions of higher learning. So when it comes to an issue of now social distance, lockdown, closure of institutions of higher learning, we've now seen education transitioning from the face-to-face learning methods to the digital aspect, where it's online e-learning platforms, access to digital portals and stuff like that. Now, one of the underlying challenges is that some of us maybe that are a little bit privileged, that had access to computers and laptops and had network access and data and stuff, were a bit privileged and better off as compared to other students. And this is the majority that I'm talking about, that are coming from rural backgrounds, where when we talk about network coverage, it's them being able to go on top of a tree for them to be able to even send a text message. So these challenges were very draining when it comes to students. And not only is it draining in the term of in terms of access, but also draining psychologically, mentally, because the pressure became very rapid, where you were able to at least do things off time. Now you are able to ask questions in class, you're able to learn from one another, but all of those privileges were taken away, where it was just you and a gadget, and learning became very boring to a certain extent, but also impossible for those that are coming from these different backgrounds. So if there's anything that we've learned, is the need for us to be better prepared, and for the need for us to address inequalities that are pressed with regards to education. Access should be equal across board. Access now in this regard is also moving forward in terms of technological devices, to say that if student A has access to a laptop, student B should also have access to a laptop. Then whose role is it then to ensure that student B also has access to a laptop? It becomes our role as student leaders to continue being active advocates for ensuring that our students that we aim to represent have access to all of this different opportunities, different gadgets, different devices, and so forth. But at the end of the day, is able to address the inequalities that are within the education system. So I feel if there is anything really that we need to take away from the challenges that COVID has brought, it has brought forth the structural inequalities that are possessed in the educational system that we have. So firstly, that we need to ensure is that as student leaders, we need to continue being active advocates for access and equal access to our students that we aim to represent. Now, the transition that I've spoken about is about issues of access, issues of technology, issues of network challenges, and so many other that trickle down to even mental challenges, to depression, to just not students having access to even social programs or social aid that are offered in institutions of higher learning or educational institutions. So all of this really played a critical role in us as students. But at the end of the day, I feel it's part of the students. We are able to push through. It says a lot about our generation. It says a lot about who we are, and it says a lot about the importance and the energy and the effort that we pushed through, even in terms of such dying and trying, testing and trying situations. Now, with regards to the whole decolonizing aspect, for me, and I think I've highlighted on that around my presentation, is to say that when we talk about a decolonized education system, it's not ultimately us throwing away or just doing away with the current education system that we have. But the most important aspect is us going back at the drawing table and deliberately reforming the education that we have. Now, when we are reforming it, when we are revising the curriculums that we have, what is it that we are focusing on? We need to understand that the curriculums that we are currently using are curriculums that were established by the colonial era. And most of the content that we have are addressing colonial issues, are there to the benefit of them. We've not really addressed the challenges of our own people. We are not addressing the status quo. We are not addressing what it is that we feel is relevant to us And by that, we need them to go back and start deliberately talking about it. We need to openly talk about it, to say that when we have a research methodology class, for example, what is it that as students we need to focus on? What is the research method that we need to address? What is the even the question format that we need to take, the tools, the samples, everything, it needs to be directly of the status quo. It needs to speak directly to what it is that we want to achieve now. We need to do away with the colonial system that we have and be able to have a reform system that we ourselves has established. But also with that said, what it is that is there in the current system that works for us, we should ought to keep it. But whatever is there that we feel does not work for us, then that is what I'm trying to press on, that it needs to be changed. But how do we then change it? Is by us as student leaders and as young people actively speaking out against it, actively championing for it, actively advocating for a curriculum review, actively advocating for a change of the curriculum that it is that we have now, to say that if it's not addressing our current dynamics, if it doesn't speak to our people, if it doesn't address the issues that our people are going through, then let us go back and reform it. Let us go back and revise and put what it is that addresses the issues of our people. And for instance, when we go back to a history class, the history books have been designed in a way, or history textbooks have been designed in a way that it praises the colonial era, that it sort of illustrates or portray them as the masters that came to set us free. But at the end of the day, that's not what we ought to believe in. So we need to go back and rewrite our own history. We need to go back and rewrite our own curriculum. We need to go back and revise that to ensure that it speaks to the current dynamics and the current trials of us as young people, of our current generation and the future moving forward. Because our children and our children's children cannot be taught about about how the white man came on a horse and did this, or about how the colonial era happened. It's not as relevant anymore. So we need to start addressing issues and getting solutions to our own problems. And that decolonization is what we need to be advocating for, starting as of right now.
Thank you so much, Esther. That was a fantastic answer. So I'm going to cheat code things just a bit because we are running out of time. So I'm going to pose questions to Carolina, but Carolina, I also want you to use this opportunity to give your closing remarks as well. And then we'll give Peter his closing remarks and then Esther her closing remarks. I hope that's fine. I know but do not feel as if you've cut short on time. Use as much time as you want.
No,
Just put
I don't.
it all together. So Esther, there's two questions that I think really stuck out for me from the floor. And the first question, essentially spoke to this notion of, if I can find it here. Yeah, so the one is very basic. It's really straightforward. I think it was from Nishal, which is, what sector do you think would make the most amount of change in our quality of life? So that's the first question. And then the second one is a bit more nuanced. And it's the question of, what type of mentality should students leaders have in their approach to solving our challenges in this COVID pandemic that enshrine this notion of building your society, right, and building your country. So in these troubling times that we find ourselves in, what approaches should we be taking to really build that sense of society and build that sense of country? So the first one, what sectors will improve our quality of life? And the next one is, how do we build a society as student leaders?
I think I can answer, and I promise I will answer very briefly. These two questions combined. I think, just how I said it, when you actually teach students from all ages how to be good citizens, how to think about how to be concerned about the environment, about social problems through education, I think that's the sector that can really improve our lives. But the problem is with education, there's nothing immediate. I mean, it takes time for people to learn and acknowledge and grow, but we mustn't give up. And the second question about what can student leaders do, a lot has been said here about the role of the students as leading roles in this whole process. And I think as leaders, we should not just be leaders, but also empower all students and make all students know, since early childhood to high school or universities, make all students know that we have voice and have the power to change. Of course, it's not always easy. We have difficulties and problems and in each and every country, but I think the challenge in leadership is not to be isolated, being a leader and just inspiring people, but also one of the jobs and the roles of a true leader, and of course a student leader, is also to empower other people, empower other students to make a difference as well. So I think I answered briefly, but thank you very much.
Do you have any other closing remarks that you would like to give? Just words of wisdom to all the student leaders on this particular call, or any advice that you want to give this global audience?
Well, I don't know if there's anything else to be said after so many great insights on education and what can we do to build a better future. But one thing that I think this kind of event shows us is how important it is to talk about our problems, but also talk about solutions, and how important it is to learn and connect with people all around the world. So I think if there's a final final word for me to say, would be, let's keep doing this. Let's keep talking and connecting and being in touch, because we can learn from each other and we can help each other. And if we don't isolate ourselves, if we see the world as our world, I think it will lead us to a better future.
Oh, thanks so much for that. And to Pete, I'm going to hand over to you. And like I said, I'm doing a bit of a cheat code to the system, but there's one question that I want, Peter, for you to incorporate in your closing remarks. And so as you give your closing remarks, just please give us an answer to what partnerships can be formed from this platform that we're creating and others to support the AASU. So similar to the comment that I made earlier around how do we mobilize across the continent in particular, how do we push forward the decolonial agenda, and how do we just participate more in your activities?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that a good starting point here is what we've just done. And I think that I would want to just use the opportunity to say once again, thank you to UCT for this opportunity to share the perspectives. I think that moving forward as young people, we need to cooperate more than compete. I don't think that it's a zero-sum game. That one wins shouldn't be at the loss of another person. And usually, more often than not, that's what young people have come to do. So instead of forming solidarity groups to achieve things, we rather seek to compete against each other. And sometimes it's not really healthy. And so the point that I'll leave with students that are listening and young people is that the solutions to the world's problems lie with us. It does lie with us, sometimes at the individual level, at the organization level, and a lot more of the times we will not get appreciated for the work that we're doing. We've done a lot of human rights work, we've done a lot of child rights work, and sometimes we despair. We are not seeing the results that we want. And so my other colleague said that, you know what, Peter, sometimes the outcomes that we seek will not happen in our generation. Nonetheless, it should not despair us from forging ahead and fighting. And so I would say that if anything at all, the quest to want to build a better world is one that should inspire us. It should be the reason why we wake up from bed every day and want to be able to build solidarity. As we know it, if you want to go, if you want to, there's the saying about if you want to go far, you need to be able to do so with people. If you want to go, then you can go fast. And so at the end of the day, I do think that we must build solidarity. We must cooperate rather than compete. So these are my closing words, and I thank everybody for making the time to join us.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. And I want to hand over to Esther. And similar, Esther, there's a question that I really want us to really touch on. And so if you can incorporate it into your closing remarks, that would be fantastic. And so the questions from Asanda, and I don't want to paraphrase her, except the very beginning. And her question is related to this notion of civic education and early childhood education and how that entrenches citizenship, right? Those avenues that people use to really educate young people about what it means to be a citizen. And the question is, do you think that these same channels, right, these channels that build childhood education, that entrench citizenship, can be used as tools to address the social ills that are deeply entrenched in our societies? Ills like gender-based violence through consent culture. And do you believe that young children should be learning about consent or racism? So can we use these channels that build citizenship to really talk about the deep-seated social ills in our society, like gender-based violence, like racism, and how do we educate young people around consent?
All right. No, thank you very much for the question. I think definitely we have to use these different platforms, because if there's anything that I feel is very critical and is very important, is early childhood development. And if there's something that sticks with a child, is what they were taught when they were young. So if we are able to use these different platforms to teach young people or the smaller kids around the issue of gender-based violence, around the issue of consent, around all these different social ills, then I think we'll be doing justice to ourselves. Because most of the times, and I've seen with perpetrators of gender-based violence, we have a program here in Namibia where it's free of voice, a kind of program where they openly speak about what led them to doing what it is that they did and their childhood and their upbringing. Now, if there's anything in common that I've seen in this trend, is that most of them are either coming from very violent homes where they have seen their mothers or their sisters being violated by their fathers and uncles. Some of them are coming from communities which are pressed with many of these social ills, be it racism, where they've seen a black child throwing words to a white child, and it's deemed perfectly okay in their community. So growing up, they have this culture. Or where they've seen a white child throwing words to a black child, and it's deemed perfectly correct. So growing up, some of these bad or terrible cultures remain instilled into these children, which ultimately trickles into younger people or the elder generation of our states. So if at all we are able to, or we want to do justice to ourselves, then we need to use these different platforms at early childhood development, be it from pre-primary, to ensure by just teaching them simple stuff, to say that when you say this to this, it's not kind. When you pull a girl by her hair, it's not okay. So the small acts of violence, if they are taught that those things are not okay from a younger age, then I think it's going to trickle as they grow up. So ultimately, I think what's also very important is for us to have the level of what it is that we want to educate them, because at the end of the day, they are younger kids and they need to be taught things at their level of understanding. So we need to phrase this type of education at the different paces, at different phases. Say upper primary, we have a certain content that we can maximize on. Higher primary, then we have this given content that we can maximize on, and ultimately trickle up as they move forward in terms of secondary education and until varsity. Now, also another subject that I feel is very critical and is being taken for granted is social skills or life skills per se, or social subjects where young people are being taught about issues around gender-based violence, around consent, around all these different social ills, racism, and so forth. I don't know, but it has become a culture, especially in Namibia, where this life skills classes or life skills period for fun, where learners go and try to do their homework. They use these periods to catch up and so forth. It's about time where I think we need to emphasize the importance of taking these curriculums very seriously and ensuring that in these classes, teaching and learning and education is happening. Because if we are able to do so, then we are going to do a lot of justice to ourselves, and there's a lot of understanding that is going to be there, because now there's a right of consent. You can't want to teach a 30-year-old, a 21-year-old around consent when throughout their childhood growing up, consent was not an issue. They felt you just need to do what it is that you feel like doing with a girl, and it's perfectly okay. So if you are able to start from as young as 2-3 years of age, they're able to say, when you say yes is yes, no is no. They're able then to grow into that culture and habit of always asking, of always being kind, and issues of gender-based violence, I think, will be done away with. The second question was around, consent and racism. I think I've touched on all of it, or is there one that I've left out?
No, I think you've touched on all of it quite brilliantly, actually.
All right, now with regards to my closing remarks, I'll just like to thank the Vice-Chancellor as well as the SRC President and the entire organizing committee for organizing this much needed discourse. I've learned a lot, and one of the key takeaways for me is regional and global cooperations where we need to really align ourselves to be able to work together in order to achieve what it is that we want to achieve. I would like to leave the viewers with a quote from Chikane Shikongo, who says that for every young person, there is a voice inside him or her that has the potential to change the world. Now, with that quote, what I want to elaborate on is that let us continue to be the voice of the voiceless. Let us continue to share our views. Let us continue to share our ideas and opinions without any fear or favor. Let us continue to advocate for what it is that we believe in. And at the end of the day, the future that we envision for is going to materialize through the ideas and the views that we continue to share and advocating for at different platforms. Again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Esther, for coming onto this panel with us, and to all our panelists. I am now going to relinquish the power of being chair, even though it's always very tempting to hold on to this power, and give it over to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Loretta Feris.
Sorry, I was talking to myself, and in doing so, I was thanking you, Rekgotsofetse, for being a very able moderator and for holding the space in such a wonderful way. So thank you for that. But I also want to thank the panelists. I thought this was a wonderfully rich and stimulating conversation, and also a critical conversation, which is of course part of what it means to be at a university. At times, I thought I wish I could step in and ask some questions or engage with some of these views that range from citizenship to social justice to sexual and gender-based violence, decolonization, the environment. I think it was a wonderful opportunity to bring students together to think about all of these issues that affect students, but actually our broader communities. And so thank you everyone who participated, Akha, Larissa, Peter, Esther, Carolina. You made us think, and you made us think critically, and we want to thank you for participating. And then finally, this event didn't just happen, it took a team. As the Vice-Chancellor said, she gave us the challenge, and I want to thank her for giving us the challenge. But then I really want to thank the team. This was conceptualized by the SRC and of course the Department of Student Affairs, who conceptualized and organized this event, and the Department of Student Affairs in particular. I want to say thank you to Edwina Brooks and her team, Christina and Lindy, for putting together this wonderful event, together with all of the staff that always helps us to make sure that the events run smoothly. And we continue to rely on the support from our communications department and from our ICTS, our IT department. So thank you very much, Nico, for your support this evening. And this is it. Sadly, have a good evening, have a good day, have a good morning, wherever you are, and we will definitely do this again. Bye-bye.